Welcome to Ilanomics. The big headlines are coming from the India-China border in Ladakh and of course the coronavirus pandemic with death rates and infections going up in Mumbai and Delhi. But that doesn't mean economics has stopped mattering. In fact, economic policy and reform are continuing while these two other issues make headlines. Last week, the Modi government approved and passed three ordinances which were part of the Atmanirbhar Bharat package. These ordinances were to do with reforming the agriculture sector. So the good news is the government has actually kept its word. It has given legal sanction to something it announced as a policy promise. Why does this matter so much? What can this accomplish? And what else or what more needs to be done? We have Professor Ila Patnaik with us to talk about it. Ila, the government has moved fast, moved with alacrity, and walked the talk. Were you surprised by that?
The ordinances that have been announced were what Nirmala Sitharaman had said would be part of her economic agricultural reform package. And in fact, at that time also, we had discussed that this was perhaps the most important part of the package because, adding money always keeps happening. But what these ordinances tried to do was to give access or at least then the announcement said that this would give access to farmers to markets, and we could then have a national market for food. Now, what is very encouraging is that the government has followed up very quickly with ordinances. Normally, there are announcements and then one waits for laws to come. So typically what happens is that there is a budget announcement, and then before the next budget, the government does some action such as following it up with laws if it does go through. And many times, it just slips through and nobody really notices that the laws didn't come through. So it was very encouraging that these came through. But I think, in terms of surprise, it isn't very surprising because when you look back at things that the BJP has been repeatedly saying, amendment to the Essential Commodities Act was in fact one of those. In the 2014 manifesto also, national food market was something that had been a part of the manifesto. And so, yet, one often takes those things with a pinch of salt when we say politicians announce things or they put them on the manifesto. We often don't expect them to carry them through. But in that sense, I think in this case, it has been a policy or it has been an announcement that it's very good that the announcement did come through. Now these are ordinances, and we've been studying these ordinances to see whether they will fulfill the purpose or whether more is required before they are enacted as laws.
Ila, do you want to explain the significance of the three major changes that were done through the ordinances? I know they are a little technical, but in terms of limiting stocks, the extraordinary circumstances in which these ECA can be used, that is the Essential Commodities Act, which was amended. Do you want to very briefly, very simply, because I know like we talked about it and your column talks about it, these are very technical points.
Amendment to the ECA Act is the first, that the Essential Commodities Act will be amended so that primarily the intent seems to be that it should only be when there is a national emergency or when there are very extraordinary circumstances under which you should try to control what people can produce, what they can hold, at what prices can they sell, and you bring out a list of those essential commodities. The idea is that these should be restricted to war times or emergency times, very, very difficult times. It should not be that under normal times, the central government or the state government, in fact, the state governments have used this act in the past. I remember a case when combining this with the APMC agricultural the Mandi Act, with the APMC Act, Mamata Banerjee had stopped export of potatoes from West Bengal sometime in 2014-15. So, the central government or the state government should not be able to use these. Now, the idea behind this and the other two, which is the APMC Act and the Contract Farming Act, is to give farmers the power to be able to access markets and sell their produce. It is also to be able to give them certainty, so that it's not that you're imposing stock limits today, you're taking them away tomorrow, you are imposing price controls today, you're taking them away tomorrow, because this act repeatedly gets used. So what the first ordinance tries to do is that it tries to put conditions or change the conditions or restrict the circumstances in which the government can actually use this act to control what farmers do. So the central government will notify a list of commodities, and then only under war, emergency, or very extraordinary price changes will the state governments be able to use the act.
Just again to remind our viewers, we talked about it when Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman announced it, but the fact that this has actually gone through, the significance of this both for farmers and consumers. Why is this so important that we are talking about it a second time in a few weeks, Ila?
The agricultural sector was one where reforms hadn't been done. The way industry had been reformed, the way you said, we will liberalize industry in 1991. So you removed restrictions on what you could produce. You also removed restrictions on imports. So import licensing and industrial licensing went away, which meant that people could produce more and they could sell more. So exports also increased, and many restrictions that were there on industry went away, but the restrictions on agriculture did not go. Now, this is a step in that direction. In fact, when I was looking these up, I found a very interesting old document. It was a 2001 document, which was a BJP economic resolution from Amritsar, where they had their national executive meeting. And there was a committee for agricultural policy and reforms, of which Narendra Modi was a member. It was a 6-member committee of which Narendra Modi was a member, which proposed an amendment to the ECA then, and some of the other steps that are, how do we make agricultural markets more free? So I think the BJP has been talking about it for a while. And in fact, when I then started looking at how many times have they talked about it, then in many of the resolutions, they were talking about amendment to the ECA Act. So I think this is part of that, maybe the philosophy, which is that you free the industry, but unless you have markets working in agriculture cannot really go forward. So my sense is that this is an important part of that journey to freeing up agricultural markets, and making that allows incentives for farmers. It gives them more stability. It gives the market the certainty that it's not that tomorrow limits will be imposed on their production or their stocks.
And how does it help you and me, the consumers?
It helps us because it takes away the large margins that intermediaries, or at least reduces large margins. So what this will allow is direct farmers to sell directly to us. Or if sometimes it's not us, then it is to those who manufacture, say, ketchup or jam or use their products. It will allow farmers to sell directly to them. So that's part of what at least the APMC reform that has been proposed. The ECA also, by giving farmers more, the amendment to the ECA, by giving farmers more certainty that it won't suddenly be that there will be a raid on those who are holding, say, onions or rice or whatever has been on that list, pulses, edible oils that have been notified, then that certainty allows them to invest more. Investment in warehouses, investment in infrastructure, in those businesses will take away the extra margins that sometimes, the margins are 30 to 45%. Sometimes people say in extremely perishable products, the margins can go up to 70 to 80%. That's what some studies show. So the consumers then get access, not just in terms of price, but also, if people are allowed to hold stocks of agricultural produce, then there are things which today you can get only seasonally, but holding of produce will allow us to smooth our consumption and will give us access to products throughout the year, or at least through many months of the year, as we see happening in many of the industrialized countries.
That 2001 document you mentioned is very interesting. I mean, you can see it as a glass half full or half empty. It has taken us 19 years to actually go through with those reforms. Or we can say that finally we have been able to realize something we planned 19 years back. Obviously, Prime Minister Modi has a very good memory.
I think that what's been happening is that some of this has, and the emphasis on agriculture has been repeated in many of the BJP's positions. And of course, the question that you would naturally ask is then, why wasn't it done right away in 2014? And that's where I think that, politics matters in terms of you try to do things that are easy to do and that will have less opposition. Now you look at not just ECA, but you also look at the APMC reforms. There have been many attempts through these years, through all regimes, through the UPA as well as the NDA, to amend APMC laws or to repeal them. Some states actually did repeal them, like Bihar did. But the politics has always gone against it. Those trader lobbies who are locally very important, support state governments, perhaps fund them, but they've managed to hold many state governments, hold back many state governments from agreeing to these reforms, from accepting them. So I guess, a crisis like this is a time when very few people are going to oppose what you are trying to do. I think it's also that at this time, you see, look at rural India. Rural India is seeing less cases. It is safer, less corona cases, it is safer. Last week's CMIE data showed that actually rural employment and rural labor force participation has bounced back very sharply. Urban hasn't as much, but rural has certainly bounced back very sharply. So now this is the time when you need more incomes, because there are more people. There's your young labor force is there and is able to get back to work. So that's a time when you need to increase rural incomes. So I think it's a combination of both those factors.
But there is still some distance to go, like you argue in your piece. States have been given too much control. Export restrictions can come into play, and you argue that this is not good enough. These restrictions should also go, and that would be complete reform. Why do you say that?
So what this ordinance does, and the amendment does, is that it restricts the conditions under which you can impose, say, stock limits. It's fine to restrict those conditions for stock limits, but then states continue to have other powers. They can restrict prices. They can say who you sell to. So some of those will actually undermine the intent of the law, which is to give certainty and to reduce the arbitrary power of the states or the arbitrary power of governments. So what is needed, I feel, what is needed is either you repeal this and say, as many other countries have done. So this is a World War II law, and in World War conditions, of course, you know, governments were trying to not let people hoard essential commodities and so on. So it's perfectly fine to have a World War II law, maybe a few years also after that. But now we're nearly approaching 100 years. After, we're after World War II, we are not under those conditions anymore. So I would say either you just make it that it will only be applicable when a war is declared, so that it's not that it can be misused by any state government, or you repeal it. You don't give such arbitrary powers at all under any circumstances. So for example, one of the circumstances is an extraordinary rise in prices. Now, you can, if a commodity has been notified as essential by the central government, then the state government can, if there's an extraordinary rise in prices, then it can use this law. Now, we can always argue about what is an extraordinary rise in prices, but basically, the argument that my co-author Shubha Roy and I are making in this is that don't give so much power to governments, which should only be there for war times. The other question here is restrictions on exports. So while those stock limit restrictions for exports will go based on what's coming from the ECA, but then there is this Foreign Trade Regulation Act, which allows governments to impose limits, and this is regularly used. You find that the price of a commodity is increasing domestically, immediately an export ban is put on. I mean, you'll read in the papers how many times there's an export ban on rice, there's an export ban on onions, on many commodities. And what it does then is that exporters are not able to ensure markets that there will be supply, and they're not able to trade the way they would have been able to. And at the end of it, it's their producers, the farmers, who suffer. And interestingly, that is also one of the things that's there in the 2001 resolution. That should remove restrictions on exports. So we should be optimistic.
We should be optimistic. Let's hope that more of those good ideas from almost 2 decades back are implemented and we see more reform. For now, I think we should be glad that the government has been able to walk the talk on the promises it made, or the announcements it made at the beginning of the Atmanirbhar Bharat announcements. Thanks for watching this episode of Ilanomics. We will be back with you next week with a fresh one. And I would like to thank all our readers and viewers for their generous subscriptions to ThePrint. And for those of you who have not made those subscriptions, I would appeal to you to please check our contribute page and take those subscriptions. Thank you for watching this, and please continue to watch our YouTube channel. We'll be back next week.